Thursday morning, 9 a.m. That's when the fun begins. It's another edition of Our Town on 94.9 and 99.1 The River. My name is Darren Swenson. Our Town, as always, brought to you by Decorah Bank and Trust. A little later on in the program, we'll have a conversation with Iowa Ag Secretary Mike Naig. We recorded this conversation last week, and we were going to play it on Saturday mornings during our Newsmakers program, but didn't have the chance to because we had the obligation to update folks on the flooding situation. And Mike Naig's conversation will be later on in the program. It's a redistricting year. The 2020 census has been counted, and that means new districts on the local level, on the regional level, on the state level. And we'll explain, actually, Ben Steines, Winneshiek County Auditor, will explain how that will all work. Ben will join us later on in the program. But our first guest this morning, talking about the issue of the transport of mental health patients and the CSS transportation services and why it is an issue and what to do about that issue, is Winneshiek County Sheriff Dan Marx. He's our first guest this morning on Our Town on 94.9 and 99.1 The River. Having a conversation this morning with Winneshiek County Sheriff Dan Marx. He earlier this week met with the Winneshiek County Board of Supervisors on a couple of interesting topics. And the main thing we're going to be focused on is CSS transport, the transport of mental health patients from one situation to another situation, and how law enforcement should or should not be involved in that process. What, Dan, was your goal of bringing that issue up to the board earlier this week?
In the last few months, and it's been really an issue that's plagued us for years, but it's kind of been a roller coaster. If it's gone better, it's gone worse. But really in the last few months, our mental health transport service has been subpar from the standpoint of being able to get there in a timely manner. We have mental health patients who are at the hospital. They're already in crisis. To put it very bluntly, they're already having a bad day, or they wouldn't be there. And now they get caught in a system, a broken system, that the right hand isn't talking to the left hand, and it makes things worse for them and their family and the professionals that are trying to help them. The circle we're doing and the problem we're running into is that we are not supposed to even request transport until a bed space is secured. By the time we request transport, they could be out of transport drivers because they're tied up elsewhere throughout the state. And we could be looking at anywhere from 6 to 12 to 15 or more hours till a transport driver can get there. By that time, the hospital is no longer able to hold the bed because of the high demand. So we kind of end up in this vicious cycle of secure a bed, try to get a driver. By the time we get a driver, we've lost the bed. At the end of the day, nobody wins. At the end of the day, it's a lose-lose situation for everybody involved. And we're taking a already bad situation and we're making it worse.
Would you say it's more of a bureaucratic issue than an issue with the individuals involved in actually providing the service?
I would. Yeah, they can only come up with the personnel that they have. I'm not pointing the finger at any particular person. I'm pointing the finger at the system. And obviously the buck stops somewhere. So somebody's got to be responsible for that. And that's what I'm trying to point out. Yes, I think the hospital is doing their very best. I'm in constant conversations with the hospital, and they're on the same page. They see the problem. They're caught in the middle of this just like anyone else is. I've been in regular conversations as recent as yesterday with them. We have a few ideas in the hopper that are too preliminary to discuss right now that we think maybe could make things a little better. As far as the transport service through CSS, they're working with the funds they have. They're working with the personnel that's been allocated to them. Unfortunately, it's not enough and it's not working.
Where has your department gotten involved in transporting these patients in the past? And what moving forward, how should your department should your department or should not your department be involved in the transport of these mental health patients?
Great question, Darren. The short answer is yes. We did all the mental health transports in the past. All the mental health transports are handled by the sheriff's office. And in my opinion, that was a major misstep in our history. Law enforcement has no business being in the business of mental health. The overwhelming majority of these mental health patients have not committed a crime, thus they are not criminals. By placing them in the custody of law enforcement and putting them in the back of a squad car, by any reasonable person looking onto this situation would certainly give the appearance as they're being treated an awful lot like a criminal. And that sends a very poor message to someone who is in crisis and to a family member who is looking at how to assist one of their family members in crisis. In my opinion, what it's training people to do is not seek help. And that is the wrong message that we want to be sending. There's very few things, Darren, that I agree with in the major movement that's come up as of lately in the last year or two in the defund movement. But there are a few issues that if we can get past the quote defund side of it and what that kind of gives the people the impression of what it is, one of the agendas or the objectives in that movement is to move mental health away from law enforcement. And in that particular issue, and there are a few other issues within that movement that as well, and that particular issue, I believe they're right. They're on the right side of that issue. And I do think there are things that we can be doing to make things much better. And they are, they're on the right track when it comes to that kind of thing. The reality is law enforcement has gotten involved way too heavily in mental health, and it's been a disservice to mental health patients. And frankly, it's been a disservice to law enforcement.
Do most of your law enforcement colleagues, as you have conversations with other law enforcement people locally and regionally, and even beyond that, do most people in law enforcement hold your opinion regarding this issue?
I think if we were able to actually explain this particular issue, my feeling would be yes, I think they would agree. I think a lot of them get turned off at the onset when it's wrapped up into defund. I think that keeps a lot of people from coming to the table initially. But yes, my opinion is law enforcement would agree with this issue. Frankly, it's 20 some years, 24 years in law enforcement. For me personally, I can't see a downside to it. I have no idea what the reasoning would be, why someone would feel that law enforcement should be involved in mental health when we are not mental health professionals. It doesn't make sense to me. And I do think there is merit that those sort of things should be moved away from law enforcement.
And when you look at why sheriff's departments were involved in this in the first place, was it a case of you guys were the most convenient people to do it more than anything?
I think so. And that's what happens oftentimes with law enforcement. We end up being the ones who show up. We're the ones who are there. So unfortunately, it becomes a path of least resistance. Who's going to transport them? Well, the sheriff's office is there. The sheriff's office already has to serve the orders on court-ordered hospitalizations. So as long as they're already doing that, let's go ahead and take it a little further, and let's go ahead and have the sheriff's office take them into custody and provide the transport. And there is where we see things start to snowball out of control. And that's what's led to the place we are today. And I'm doing everything I can to put the brakes on this system. Let's get away from the idea of, because that's the way we've always done it, that must be the only. Explain how that's in the best interest of the patient, then I would suggest that perhaps we're doing it wrong. And just because we've done it wrong in the past, that's a pretty pathetic excuse to continue to do it wrong in the future, especially when we're talking about human beings.
And when you bring up the fact that the mental health professionals are really doing the best they can with the funding that they have, the state of Iowa has always approached mental health funding on a regionalization basis as compared to a local or an overall statewide basis. That being said, Winneshiek County is a border county. Does that create challenges that in Winneshiek County that perhaps Polk County, Johnson County, Blackhawk County don't have related to this issue?
Very much so. We have the perfect storm going on here with our geographic location. Not only are we a bordering county, but what that naturally does is we're also a rural county. And as you know, Darren, most resources are centered around more metro areas. So naturally, being a rural demographics here, we have a drive of significance to get to really anything where these higher level services for these patients in crisis are available. Now you take on top of that, our county line on its northern border shares the state line. And so for these counties that are more centrally located within the state, they can go multiple different directions and have a much better chance of finding bed space in a 360-degree radius of them, and potentially have a lot less of a travel time and better chance finding a bed. Here in Winneshiek County, again, the way the system's set up, we can't cross state lines on a court-ordered evaluation. So that means we really have two directions we can go, south or west. And both are very long drives for where most of these bed spaces are available. It's not uncommon at all that we end up having to go to Council Bluffs, or we might have to go to Iowa City or Spencer or Davenport. Bottom line, all of these places are a long ways to take a patient who is in crisis. Now, to make matters worse, we put them in the back of a caged squad car with a law enforcement officer, a deputy, and we take off across the state, only for them to get there and 3 days later have to be transported back across the state for a hearing that they may or may not even get to see a judge on, only then to be transported back across the state again to where they originally started, back at the hospital they were transported to begin with. Now, Darren, me and you right now are doing this interview by Zoom. I can hear you very clearly. You can see me. This was much more convenient for me and you. We have meetings that are done by world leaders being via electronic communication like we're doing now. And massive global business is conducted that way. Yet when it comes to assisting someone in a mental health crisis, we don't afford them this option. And there's all kinds of excuses that are given for that. And what I would submit is by putting someone in a squad car for 4, 8, 10, 12 or more hours of road time, only to be told that they're going to go back in a squad car and be transported back the other direction, and they never even got to see a judge or have any say in their own health care. It's baffling to me that we somehow twist those facts and try to pretend like that was somehow in the best interest of the patient. I don't believe the patient would agree with that. I don't believe the family members would agree with that. And where I draw from that opinion is I've talked to multiple family members and patients, countless family members and patients. And I can tell you firsthand, they are not impressed with the system.
You talk about the inability to go out of state for these mental health patients. If somehow the restrictions were lifted that you could take somebody to Rochester or La Crosse, how much of a difference would that make within this system? And what would it take to lift that restriction?
It would be very beneficial. I'll tackle that side first. It would be very beneficial because we have two world-class facilities to the northeast and northwest of us through Mayo and Gunderson. So just logistically, it would open up tremendously more bed space. And that goes for whether we're doing the transport or whether the transport company is doing the transport. Either way, it just opens up our odds for world-class healthcare. No different than if anybody has cancer, or if they're dealing with heart disease or any other illness that people deal with. In this location, we commonly see those people go to one of those facilities because we are blessed to live in a geographic location where we have probably some of the best healthcare in the world an hour away. We have people all over the world coming to both of those facilities. Yet, when it comes to mental health, again, we apply a different standard. And we can't seem to get out of that rut. What exactly would it take to be able to open up state lines? It would take a legislative action, and I'm not as versed on what exactly all that would entail, but it would take a legislative action to be able to not only open up the state lines, but they would also need to take it all the way through to figure out the logistics of how it would get paid for and how this would actually work crossing state lines with different laws. So it does get complicated. I'm not saying it's an easy task to work with differing laws in different states, but I have a hard time believing that in 2021, with all we've accomplished throughout our history, that we could not figure out a way to bring someone crisis an hour away to a facility that is able to help them. I have a hard time believing if there was truly an appetite to solve this problem, that we couldn't do it.
Would that be state or federal legislation?
I believe it'd come down to state legislation. It'd be the two states having to work together, or the three states having to work together.
And I know you brought this up to the board, and we're having this conversation primarily to create the awareness of this issue. Of course, creating awareness is important. What's it going to take to make the necessary changes that you feel would improve the system?
I think first and foremost, people have to understand the why before we can move on to the what and the how. And then there has to be a vested interest and desire and appetite to follow through, not just pay it lip service, not just talk about it, but to actually do it. And unfortunately, in order to develop that appetite for most people, they have to go through a mental health crisis, either with them personally or someone that they closely know, love, or care about, before they understand the gravity of this issue. I deal with it on a regular basis through our office, and it's become probably one of the most important topics to me, because I see people dealing with mental health issues in their family, and there's no one demographic to it. We're not talking about how much money anybody has. We're not talking about anybody's social status. We're not talking about gender. We're not talking about race. This is an issue that affects everybody across the board. And I see the same problems no matter who people are. When they deal with these problems, they're real problems, and they're reaching out and wanting somebody to help them. They're screaming and nobody is listening. And I feel that I've been screaming and nobody is listening. We are all caught in a system that can't get out of the rut of how we've always done it. And so for one, I think it's going to take an appetite, and then it's going to take people to truly keep in mind what the mission is. In order to follow through with a real world result, I always say we need realistic solutions for real world problems. And those two things have to come together, because this is a real world problem and we need a realistic solution, not one that looks good on paper, not one that sounds good in talking points, not one that works good for an interview, one that actually works in the real world. And that's where I think another area where I think a lot of times the wheels fall off. We'll hear people, we'll have people at the table right away, but then when life gets pulling people other directions, that topic tends to fizzle away. And maybe when they're in the moment, we oftentimes get a lot of people frankly, I'll say the word pressuring us at the sheriff's office that why don't you just go ahead and go back to transporting these people? And the problem is these people are real people. They're real people needing help. And it always amazes me how quickly someone will say they want to fix the problem. They want to make things better for the patient as soon as it's not convenient. But as soon as it's not convenient for them anymore, as soon as, okay, now this just got a little more complicated. Now we might ruffle some feathers if we tell people the way the system really is. Now all of a sudden they start to lose their appetite for it. And I have people pulling me aside in side conversations saying, why don't you just get one of your deputies to go ahead and do this transport? And that is the consistent cycle I see this situation in. And if we don't change that mindset, we're never going to have a permanent, realistic change for the good of everyone. And in my opinion, if you live in a family where you have never had anyone who has dealt with a mental health issue, consider yourself very, very fortunate, because you are in the minority. And chances are you may not be that lucky. Most families of some nature, of some level, deal with this. It's a real problem in a real world, and we need to start taking it very, very seriously.
And final question for you, Dan, on an unrelated topic. Another thing you touched on with the Board of Supervisors this week was a request to add a deputy to your staff. Why?
Darren, in the last just 5 years, I got a few notes here in front of me. I suspected you might ask that question. So I just in the last 5 years alone, I won't go through all of them, but some of the highlights. We've seen a 125% increase in our call volume here at the sheriff's office. And that's just the sheriff's office alone, just specifically to our agency. During that time where we've seen that 125% increase in call volume, we've only seen a 15% increase in our patrol staff. So we obviously have a major gap there as far as the level of calls going up versus the amount of people we have to respond to them. Now, I want to be clear. Our goal is to keep our service at the forefront all the time. We want to lead the way. Our constant goal with the sheriff's office here in Winneshiek County is we want to set the bar for law enforcement. We want people to look to us and say, that is how I would want my call handled if that were my family's situation or emergency. And that's important to us. And I do have concerns that will we be able to continue to maintain the same level of service we have been providing for the last many years if we don't at least make some attempt to try to bring our staff up as our call volume goes up. I have noticed over the last several years, I've had to field many more calls of people frankly upset that what took so long to get a deputy to my location. Now, not in emergencies, but just to answer a general call to service or to get a call back or to follow up on something. Our timeline for being able to get that done in a timely manner has been difficult. And so we need to shore that up somewhere. Technology helps. Technology helps make things more efficient. But at the end of the day, when somebody has a call to service, when it's their emergency, when it's their concern, they don't want to fill out a form on a computer. They don't want to get a call. They don't want to call the sheriff's office and get a menu. They want a person. They want a response, and they want to talk to a real person who cares and can actually help them. So at the end of the day, what we really need are people. In our business, there is no more important resource than our human resources. That's our deputies and the people we serve. Equipment is great, but we've got to have people. We are in a people-oriented business, and we cannot supplement that with computers and technology when it comes to giving them a direct response for their family's emergency. So to move on from that, Darren, just in the last year alone, for example, we're on track to do 500 more calls to service this year than we did last year. When I say we're on track, that is, I will fully admit that is a projection. I'm looking at where we were at last year versus where we're at this year. And 500, I think, is going to be a very realistic number, that we'll be up 500 calls just in 1 year. There's multiple more expectations of law enforcement than what there ever used to be. Well, one of them we're trying to shore up here a little bit, but mental health is a large part of what we spend our time dealing with. It's just reality. We oftentimes are the first responders to calls where someone else is having a mental health emergency. And those are things that can't wait. Now, as we've just talked about, we're working on many aspects in the mental health area to be able to get mental health professionals on the scene and on the situation as soon as possible. I'm going to go off on a rabbit trail a little bit here, Darren, but since I got the door open, there's one more thing I wanted to talk about with that. Transports with mental health are just one aspect of it. We still have the initial call response, or the initial response to the situation that's with someone in crisis. We're also working with several other groups. Elevate Mental Health Crisis Team is a team we just recently partnered with. They've been excellent. And what the idea of that is to, in less than 1 hour, be able to basically move law enforcement out of the situation and move mental health professionals into the situation to be able to better deal with the person in crisis and be able to give them truly the help they need, rather than staring at someone with a gun and a badge. So I do want to point out, I probably sound like a doomsdayer here and everything I've said with mental health. And yes, I do want things to be better. There's a lot of improvement to be made, but I want to make very clear also, there have been a lot of improvements. Things are much better than they used to be. I'm complaining right now that transports aren't as timely as they need to be, and they're not. But reality is, if you go back 3 or 4 years, there were no transports. They were all by squad car. So we are moving in the right direction. If you go back 3 or 4 years, nobody knew what a crisis response team was, let alone be able to call them. Now we have them that are available and up and running. So we are moving things in the right direction, but complacency is going to be our biggest enemy. We have to continue to push in the right direction and not sit back and say everything's perfect, because we all know it's not. So sorry for going off on a rant on that, but yeah, there's several other things that several other things you can point to that you might say, what is causing this increase in call volume? And I don't know that I have an exact answer for that. I can speculate, but I'll go ahead and try. One of the things that I would speculate is the multiple and platforms of instant communication and ease of communication. It's much easier for people to call things in real time and to be able to immediately get a hold of us. And I think that's a good thing, by the way. It's a fact that it is raising our call volume, but I think it's also a fact that people are much safer, and we're clearing a much higher caseload than we ever used to clear because of this instant communication. We can get on the scene and get investigating things much sooner. So I think at the end of the day, it's a very good thing. Increased expectations from law enforcement, and I kind of hit on some of those. And in addition to what I've talked about, I mean, public programming, public education, public involvement are all things that there's much more of a call for. We daily get multiple requests to do some sort of public program for a group or a school or organization. And those are things. Or a radio station. There you go. Yeah. So good point. But no, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. But those are all things that we want to take seriously. And those are things that are all important. And unfortunately, if we have an investigation on sitting over here and we don't have time to follow up with it, the public programming is what suffers. We want to be able to do both. We think we can have our cake and eat it too here, and that's what we're trying to do. The other reason would be officer safety. We live in a more dangerous world than what we've seen in the past. There's a lot of unrest in our society right now. 2020 was a rough year for everybody. I don't care who you are. 2020 was a rough year, full of uncertainty, a lot of unprecedented for service. When people are at home and they're not out and about and people are nervous about what the future holds, that has an impact on law enforcement. We're in the people business, and when something affects people, it affects us. So I would speculate it's probably a combination of, to some degree, all of the things that I've just mentioned. I don't know that I can't say for a fact what any one thing is. I'm just taking what I'm seeing and I'm trying to put some logic behind it.
Dan, we appreciate you taking some time and talking to us about this very important issue and creating some awareness. And hopefully through that awareness, we can get the ball moving in the right direction for the necessary changes that are related to this important matter. Always appreciate you taking the time to inform the public, and thanks for the time this morning.
Thank you, Darren. Appreciate you taking the time to give us the platform for just a little bit. Appreciate it.
Dan Marx, Winneshiek County Sheriff. Well, the 2020 census has been counted, and that means it's redistricting time on the local level, on the state level, really on the national level as well. And I always like to bring in smart people to explain things that I don't understand, which are quite a few things, and quite frankly. So Winneshiek County Auditor Ben Steines is here to explain the redistricting process. And I guess to start out with, what's happening at the local level regarding redistricting at the moment, Ben?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, every year that ends with a zero, at the federal level, they do a census, and that requires every year that ends with a 1 that we do redistricting. That affects us locally for cities that have wards, like the city of Decorah has to divide their city into 5 equal population wards, and then counties that have county supervisor districts, like Winneshiek County does, has to divide their county into equal population districts so that each ward or district has equal and fair representation. That always happens in years that end with 1, and then starting in the years that end with 2. So January 15th of 2022 would be when these new districts become effective. So just so everyone is aware, right now, this process that's currently in the works will not affect the city and school elections that are coming up November this year. So November this year will still be elections under the current districts and wards.
And where is the process? You talk about this entire process. Who is all involved in this process at the local level?
So yeah, so we get census figures from the federal government. This year is different than years past. So when we did this 10 years ago, by this point in the year, we had pretty much wrapped it all up. This year, because of COVID last year delaying the census, we didn't get our census figures and numbers until just recently. So we're kind of in a hurry up process now to get these in place in time for for next year's elections. So at the local level, the city of Decorah is the only city in Winneshiek County that has wards. So they're working with a committee of folks that will be looking at possible ward maps and choosing one that would be appropriately representative for their city. When they do this, whether it's the city or the county, I had mentioned earlier that they have to be equal population precincts and districts. When I say equal population, it's not exactly equal, but it is pretty dang close. So the city of Decorah takes their total population. They have 5 wards, so they divide it by 5. That gives them the perfect number if it was perfectly equal, and they only get a 1% variance in that number. So they have approximately 7,500 people. They have, so that would be about 1,500 per district. That only means if that were those were the numbers, they would get plus or minus 15 for each of their wards. We'll do exactly the same process for the at the county level. We'll take the total county population, divide it by 5 for the 5 supervisors, and then get all of those 5 supervisor districts to be within 1% population of that number. So the county's process is a little different because county government officials are partisan, elected by a partisan basis, whereas city officials are nonpartisan races. So because of Iowa's integrity in elections, and we're kind of held up as one of the spotlights as far as doing it the best way. They have a process where we form a committee at the county level that's a bipartisan committee, and so the Board of Supervisors appoints that committee. So they have already appointed that committee. They do appoint a bipartisan committee, but they're more worried about, you know, getting the right type of people to serve on that committee. And so one of the key members of the county's committee, both this time and last time, is the county GIS director. He does all the mapping for the county. And so if you were involved in this process 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was all done like a jigsaw puzzle. The census gave you these chunks of where people live. They call them census blocks. They aren't necessarily blocks like a city block. They can be divided by roads or rivers or valleys or other means, but they give these chunks of ground with population numbers, and you start fitting them together until you meet this ideal population. Now, with all of our technology that we have now, our GIS director is able to import those census block figures into computer and then create some equal population districts that the committee, whether it's the committee at the city level where they just appoint a committee, or the one at the county level, this bipartisan committee, can look at these different options and try to choose one that they think is most appropriate.
How did people do this before computers? I know basically, like, I look at the time when, like, we were in high school, we thought dial-up internet was a pretty cool thing. But how did people do this before computers?
They actually, I think that especially in smaller communities and smaller counties like ours, they actually took those blocks and basically started dividing them into piles and adding them up by hand until they get the right number. There wasn't the technology we have now. Now they can take their electronic map and take a road and put a line down it and see how that divides the population in two pretty easily. So it's a lot easier to do this now than it used to be, which actually helps facilitate kind of the fairness of it, where we want to make sure that these districts are divided both equally, but that we aren't trying to take into consideration any kind of political benefits of doing it.
And
so,
you explain the differences between how the city does it and the county does it. What needs to happen first? Does the city, does the county, and then up into a state legislative district, and then beyond that? And how are all these efforts how do they all coincide?
Right. So the first step, actually what has to happen first, is the state legislative boundaries. So in our county, we have traditionally, at least the last few census times, the county has been divided into at least 2 different state house districts. So assuming that happens again, we have to first consider that, because we can at the local level further divide that in like a supervisor district will contain all of that second state house district, or it may contain some of that and some of the other portion, which is what usually happens. But we have to, when we're drawing our boundaries, we have to consider those first. Secondly, we try to, in the county supervisor districts, it's already confusing for people. You know, I live in County Supervisor District 1, but I live in Decorah Ward 3 or whatever. We, at the county level, the goal is to take the city's wards as a whole. We don't want to divide up the wards any more than we have to, or have completely separate boundaries than the wards where they don't even coincide at all. So part of the goal is to have the wards as whole as they can contained in supervisor districts. I know that 20 years ago, that just because of the way it worked out, they did have to divide one of the wards in half. So half of the one ward went with one supervisor district and half went with the other, to be able to facilitate the equal population. But I haven't seen any maps yet for this year as far as how that might work out, but that'll be part of the process. So we will first get the state will do their House and Senate districts. The city and the county start at the same time, but really the county can't get far into the process till the city of Decorah is finished. I know that they are at least have some options on the table and are getting to a point where they might start finalizing a choice at the city of Decorah. To help facilitate that communication, another member of the county's redistricting committee is Wanda Hemsath, who is the city clerk for Decorah, so we can stay in the loop as far as what their process is, then to help make sure we're doing this as clean as we can.
I know when it comes to this process, Iowa is kind of known as a model nationwide of doing this thing the right way, keeping the gerrymandering and the politics out of it.
Right.
How did Iowa's process become so respected nationwide, and when are the other states going to figure it out, quite frankly?
Yeah. So it kind of starts at the state level with that, because many states use the state legislature draws the districts. And so that leaves then, since most state legislatures are political and they start drawing them in a way they think are favorable to their party. Whereas Iowa uses, it's called the Legislative Service Agency, which is a non-political, nonpartisan administrative department within the state government. So that Legislative Service Agency actually draws the districts, and they do a really good job at not considering politics and just trying to make the districts as clean as they can. If you look at our current U.S. House districts, which were drawn by the Legislative Service Agency, it's almost a quadrants of the state. They're almost straight lines where you draw one line north and south and one east and west, and that's how it worked out. And they were able to make those equal population cutoffs by using fairly straight lines, and that makes it very clean. When it gets down to the local level, we're still dealing within these smaller committees that are doing this. But like I mentioned, the county's committee is a bipartisan committee, so there are appointments made to that committee both by Republicans and Democrats, and at the city level, they're using their own committee this time that has people appointed by the city council members. So they'll be trying to keep politics out of this. It is very explicit in the code that when drawing these boundaries, cities and counties cannot consider the party affiliation or voting history of any voters in those districts. It's supposed to be done apolitically. That is not part of what's considered the voters or where the current office holders live. That cannot be considered as part of this process. That means it could mean that some of them are not in the district they were in before, and that means there's election things that will become of that in future years, but that isn't part of the consideration of this process.
And you mentioned the state legislature will be taking care of their action here in the not too distant future. And I know the city council and the school board elections won't be affected by any changes that get approved by November. The new district's going to affect January 15th of next year. Does that mean in all likelihood all 5 supervisor seats will be up next year?
Well, it'll be, that really depends on how after the districts are drawn, then we take an analysis of where the current supervisors live. So we have 2 supervisors that'll be up next year anyway because their terms are up. And then the remaining 3 supervisors, if any of them get put in the same district as each other, then any that are in that district have to be up. So that could mean that only the 2 whose terms are up will be up for election next year, or it could mean all of them are up. We won't know that until after the districts are adopted. Now, that being said, 10 years ago, there were 3 that had terms up anyway, and then the other 2 got put in the same district, so all 5 of them had to run the following year. So that does happen and can happen. So
is there anything else the public needs to know? Anything we haven't covered about this process?
Nope. I think it's just good for the public to know that this is done and is as apolitically as possible. We try to draw the districts, at the city. They like to use, some of the main streets, just try to make them clean districts. So in the current plan, they use like Mechanic Street and Water Street and College Drive and Montgomery Street. I mean, the streets that people know where they are and they know then how to divide those up. So, and at the county, we try to use full townships wherever we can. Much of the county's population is centered in the Decorah city or Decorah area. So that always needs to be divided up into multiple supervisor districts just to make it feasible to get equal population. But almost always the other townships are added to districts as a whole. So the whole Kelmer Township, including the cities of Calvert and Spillville, all get put in together into one district because we like to keep that as clean as possible. So the real goal is to make this a clean process that people can know more easily what their district is when we get done. I know that it's still hard for the public to realize, we still have people that say, well, I used to be in this, or I was always in this district, even though it changed 10 years ago, and they're still just now getting used to the change that took place 10 years ago. So I know next year people will be confused or may have questions about what their district is now, and they should always feel free to contact the auditor's office, and we can help them know which city ward or which supervisor district they're in. There are also a number of places on the internet, whether it's on the county website or the Secretary of State website, has a really good feature where you can enter your address and it'll tell you which district you're in. So everyone should just realize, just because they always voted at a specific location or always were in a certain district, that it isn't always, and it could very well change next year.
Well, Ben, you've made us all smarter people by explaining this process. Thanks for taking the time and telling us what's going on with the redistricting process, and always a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for the time. Have a great day.
Yep, thank you, and thanks for inviting me.
Ben Steines, Winneshiek County Auditor, talking about the redistricting process. Having a conversation this afternoon with Iowa Ag Secretary Mike Naig. And Mike, obviously it's been a little bit of a difficult year for producers related to the weather. Not enough rainfall throughout the course of the growing season. How are the crops doing overall right now with everything producers have had to deal with this summer?
Well, drought has definitely been the top of mind issue for a lot of Iowa farmers. And, at this stage of the game, where something north of 70% of the state of Iowa is somewhere between D0 and D3 drought. And about 10% of the state has that D3 or extreme drought condition. And so it is the dominant weather issue for most folks. That said, we've got parts of the state that have seen exactly what they need from a weather standpoint, and we'll see record yields. And so we're going to have parts of the state that have reduced yields because of too much water, reduced yields because of not enough water, and then we're going to have some places with phenomenal yields. So it's really going to be across the board. But I think, generally speaking, the crop looks surprisingly good given how dry we really have been.
As of this moment, and I know this could probably change in 2 days, so it's probably an unfair question, but as of this moment, what's the best case scenario moving forward? What would be the scenario we least want to see?
Right. There's still upside for if we can get timely rain, and we have over the last few days seen widespread rain, hopefully not severe in nature, but the crop can definitely benefit. We can increase yield even at this stage of the game. And so there's still an upside if we can see moisture. Now, on the other hand, if we shut things off, we can still degrade this crop more so. And so we're still in that game where here we are, even at the end of August, that there's still upside and there's still downside. It all depends on what Mother Nature brings to us. But again, I think across the state, we're going to see strong yields. There will be portions of the state, however, that just will not even see average just because of the persistent dry conditions that we've seen through the summer.
I know last week was the Iowa State Fair. How good did it feel just being back on the fairgrounds and having that event this year?
Oh, it's so good to be back. And, we didn't set any sort of record from an attendance standpoint, but there were well over 1 million people there. It was a strong showing. It was an every day at the fair. It just felt good to be there. Of course, one of my highlights is getting through the livestock barns and getting into the 4-H building and seeing the FFA exhibitors. And for our young people, I feel so happy and we're so fortunate that they got a chance to compete and that Iowans just got a chance to get out and see the great Iowa State Fair. It was good to be back.
And as for the young people, I know they've had a lot of things taken away from them over the last 18 months. I'm sure you talked to quite a few of them. How appreciative of them were they of the opportunity that they had this year?
Oh, my goodness. I get around to a lot of county fairs, and you could see it in their eyes at the county fair. Good to be back. You're spot on, by the way. They missed out on a normal school year. They missed out on all the different activities, music and speech and athletics, of course, and just a number of things that just weren't normal for them. And so to be back and to show and to compete, and that's important. Those are important lessons for our kids, and they represent that next generation of folks who are going to work in agriculture, and I don't want them to miss out on those things. And so it was very good to be back. You could tell that families and the kids, everybody was appreciative.
I understand there is a butchery task force that has recently been established. Tell us about that.
Right, and this came out of the legislative session. Two things happened. One, the legislature approved a new grant program. It'll be administered jointly between the Economic Development Authority and the Iowa Department of Agriculture. And so we're excited to roll that out. That'll be news that's coming soon, but we'll be excited to offer grants to meat lockers to expand their capacity. One of the other things that came alongside that grant program establishment was the need to look at workforce in this meat processing and meat locker business. And as I travel the state and visit with our lockers, they will continue to tell me that workforce, finding people to fill those jobs, is one of their great challenges. That's skilled labor. You can't just hire anybody. You've got to have folks who can do the job, and there's training required. And so we just announced, and we'll be leading this task force, a group of folks that are going to get together and really dig into what are some of those solutions, what are some things that we can do to try to help provide that qualified quality workforce that those meat lockers really need.
And did some of this come out of a lot of these meat processing plants being shut down in the upper Midwest related to COVID-19? Is that where a little bit of this conversation started?
Absolutely. There's two things that drive this, I think. One is we experienced a significant disruption in meat processing last year. And so folks had to look for other ways to try to take some of the pressure off that system. And I want to be clear, even a dramatic expansion of capacity at those small meat lockers, it won't rival or offset what happens in those large meat processors. We need them to be functional and resilient. But this does help. And here's the other thing that's driving it. We have a lot of farmers and a lot of consumers who are really interested in selling direct from the farm to the consumer. And that can be done at smaller scale. That can be done through those small meat lockers. I think that's a tremendous growth opportunity for those farmers, and a great opportunity for consumers to buy local, to know where their meat comes from, know the producer, and be able to maybe even customize how they're getting the meat cut and processed. And that's a great thing. So Iowa's got a great brand for agriculture and certainly for meat production. I think there's a huge upside. We've just got to continue to address that capacity and that workforce challenge.
And related to the sale of these small meat processing plants and their ability to sell their products to the consumer, if memory serves, there was some lifting via the USDA to allow that to be done across state lines a little better. And I know in our area that affects the Lime Springs plant off the top of my head. How did that all come to fruition? What are the early returns of that being lifted?
Well, historically, you had to be a federally inspected, a USDA inspected plant to be able to sell across state lines. And we pursued a program that it's called Cooperative Interstate Shipping. And what that allows is that you can remain a state inspected by the Iowa Department of Agriculture. You can remain a state inspected locker. You can achieve this additional certification, and that allows you to sell across state lines. We've got a lot of interest across meat lockers in the state of Iowa. We've only got about a dozen that have gone through the actual CIS certification process, but we've got another dozen who are in process, and a lot of folks who have told us, hey, we're too busy right now to even go through that process, but we are very interested and we're going to do it sometime in the future. Again, this just shows you that there's a tremendous opportunity for those small meat lockers, those Iowa inspected, Iowa based meat lockers to be able to really market their products all across the United States. And it'll just be even more of an opportunity for our great agriculture producers.
And from what I understand, there's a project or a program that has started related to cover crop cost sharing. Tell us about that.
You bet. Well, this is the time of year as we're headed into harvest. We want folks to be thinking about getting a cover crop planted. And what we think about there is it's after the corn or the soybean crop is harvested. Let's get something seeded onto that ground to cover that ground throughout the winter and throughout the spring months when the rain is falling, but there's no crop that's actively growing. That does two things. One, it really helps preserve the soil. It builds soil health and soil quality, but it also prevents soil erosion. All of that leads to better water quality. So it's really important that we see more cover crops across the state. We've got well over 2 million acres today, and we need to maybe double and even triple that, and that's what we're working towards. How do we do that? There's a couple ways. One is through cost share. Folks can contact their county conservation office and receive traditional cost share of $25 or $15 per acre. And then there's a new program that we'd like to share folks about the last couple of years. And what it offers is a $5 per acre reduction in your crop insurance premium for every acre planted to cover crops. It's a new way to try to reach more folks and provide an incentive over more acres. Again, a $5 per acre reduction in your crop insurance premium if the acre is planted to cover crops. Really excited about the success there. Our program has been modeled in Illinois and Indiana, and so proud of that. And we're really working. We think that this may be a program that USDA may ultimately want to apply nationwide because we've been able to do the work to prove its success in Iowa. And for more information, go to cleanwateriowa.org for that program.
As you travel around the state and talk to producers, what are their main concerns right now?
Right now, obviously, that weather situation still is the dominant issue, and And we're getting close to harvest, right? We're going to be going to the fields in September and into October, and folks are anxious to see what's out there. So that's very much on our minds. I'd say the other thing that's what that people are thinking about is some of the regulatory and some of the tax uncertainty that we're seeing out of Washington, D.C. A reopening of waters of the U.S. provides uncertainty. We are still waiting for some clear guidance on what the administration is going to do on ethanol and biodiesel. And those are things that are so critically important to Iowa. And so those types of things, impact on taxes, stepped up basis and state tax, those are all things that dramatically impact farmers, farm businesses, ag businesses. And I'd say those are the types of things that have folks concerned. They need to see certainty. They need to understand where we're going.
Anything else you want to pass on? Anything we're missing?
Well, I would just say to folks, if your farmers are in the farm community, be thinking about safety as we head to the field this fall, and we all want to make sure that we get through the harvest season in one piece and very safely. And if you're not in the farm community, but you travel around and you're seeing tractors on the road, I would just ask you to give folks a wide berth. They work long hours and they can't always see you as well as you can see them. And let's be really mindful of that on the roads this fall.
Mike, we appreciate the time. Thank you.
Great visiting with you.
Our thanks to our guest on the program this morning, Winneshiek County Sheriff Dan Marx, Winneshiek County Auditor Ben Steines, and Iowa Secretary of Agriculture Mike Naig. Don't forget, each and every week, you can watch Our Town. We put it on our YouTube channel each and every week. And we're doing a lot of these interviews via Zoom. You can actually see the interesting people we talk to on a week in and week out basis. We post that to our River Facebook page every Wednesday afternoon. So not only can you listen to it Thursday mornings at 9 a.m., if you miss the show, you can watch Our Town on our YouTube channel. Our thanks to our guest, our thanks to our sponsor, Decorah Bank and Trust, and our thanks to you for tuning in. We invite you to do it again next Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. This has been Our Town on 94.9 and 99.1 The River.